Hey 7X, today we're going to start a new 8th grade topic on the Pythagorean Theorem. Okay, so what is the Pythagorean Theorem? The Pythagorean Theorem is all about right triangles. And the Pythagorean Theorem states that the square of the hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the square of the other two sides. Okay, so again, this only works with right triangles, and there are a lot of new vocabulary words in this unit. So that definition I know seems really overwhelming, so we're going to take some time to break it apart. So, first things first, like I said, it's incredibly important to remember that the Pythagorean theorem again only works with right triangles. It does not work with any other type of triangles. So, we need to be able to identify if we have a right triangle or not. And please recall that in order to have a right triangle, we need to have a right angle. And a right angle must be equal to 90 degrees. So there are ways to identify if you have a right triangle or if you have a 90-degree angle, and that's by that little box that's in the corner of the triangle. So we're just going to quickly look at these 5 triangles right here and identify which are right triangles and which are not. So if I look at this first triangle right here, I see this little box in the corner. That tells me that this is a right triangle. That tells me that this angle right here with that little box is the 90-degree angle. So I'm simply going to drag and drop it into this right angle box. Then I'm going to look at my second triangle up here. Okay, so this triangle right here does not have a little square in the corner. It does not say that any of these angles are equal to 90 degrees, so this is not a right triangle. Okay, this third triangle right here, the only angle that we have labeled is a 130-degree angle, which we know from our previous unit on triangles that this is going to be an obtuse triangle, so it's not a right triangle. Okay, then we have this green triangle right here, and again, we have a little box in the corner, which tells me that that's a 90-degree angle, which makes it a right triangle. And last but not least, last but not least, we have this triangle, which again has a little box in the corner, making it a 90-degree angle and a right triangle. Okay, so again, guys, super duper important. We need to remember that the Pythagorean theorem will only work when we have a right triangle. Okay, so with right triangles, there's a bunch of vocabulary words we have to memorize. The first word you're going to be hearing a lot is something called the hypotenuse. And the hypotenuse is always the longest side of a right triangle. It is also always located opposite of the right angle. So if we look at this right triangle here, here's my right angle. The hypotenuse is always the side that's directly opposite from that. So it's a little hint. If you always draw an arrow from the right angle to the side, that will always give you your hypotenuse. Again, you need to remember that the hypotenuse, is always the longest side. Now, that only takes care of one side of a right triangle. There's 2 other sides. The 2 other sides of the right triangle are called the legs. Okay? So the legs are just the 2 sides that form the right triangle. So this is a leg and this is a leg. Okay, and again, your hypotenuse is the side opposite of the right angle. Okay, so again, 2 vocab words you need to know. Hypotenuse, longest side of the right triangle, and is always opposite of the right angle. And then the 2 legs are the other sides of the triangle. Okay, so we're going to go back to this definition. So the Pythagorean theorem states that the square of the hypotenuse, this long side here, is equal to the sum of the 2 squares of the other 2 sides of the triangle. So, in other words, what that tells me is this hypotenuse of this triangle, the square of the hypotenuse of this triangle is going to be equal to the squares of these 2 legs added together. Okay? So, our Pythagorean theorem is a squared plus b squared equals c squared. A is a leg, B is a leg. C is always your hypotenuse. So again, what the Pythagorean theorem tells me is if I take a leg, I square it. I take the other leg, I square it, and I add those 2 squares together, it's going to equal the hypotenuse squared. And that will work for every single right triangle that we have. Okay, so let's just take some time to identify the legs and the hypotenuse of each right triangle, because sometimes you're going to be asked to find a leg and other times you're going to be asked to find a hypotenuse, and you need to be able to identify which is which. Okay, so if we look at this triangle right here, start with your hypotenuse. Okay, again, your hypotenuse is the longest side of the triangle and is also located directly opposite of the right angle. So here's my right angle. Remember, you can draw your little arrow. Whatever side that arrow is pointing to is going to be your hypotenuse. So this side right here is my hypotenuse. So I'm simply going to drag and drop this word hypotenuse right there. Okay. Now, these two sides that we have left are the legs. They don't have different names. They're both called legs. Okay. So we simply drag and drop. Okay. You guys are now going to label this triangle for me. All right. So again, just to reiterate before we do some practice with this, the Pythagorean theorem states that for any right triangle, the square of the longest side, which is the hypotenuse, equals the sum of the squares of the other two sides, or the legs. Okay, so again, here we have a right triangle. My hypotenuse is 5 right here. The Pythagorean theorem tells me that if I square that hypotenuse, it is going to be equal to the squares of the two legs added together. So my one leg is 3, I square it, I get 9. My second leg is 4. I square it, I get 16. I add this together. 9 plus 16 equals 25. 25 equals 25. Yes, it does. This will always be the case. The number on the right will always equal the number on the left of the Pythagorean theorem. Okay, just a quick refresher. When we're using the Pythagorean theorem, we need to square numbers and we need to take the square root of numbers. We did this way back in the beginning of the year. So remember, when we square a number, you're taking that number, the base, and multiplying it by itself. When we take the square root, we're doing the opposite. We're finding what two numbers multiply to get the number underneath the radical sign. So if we look at right here, we have a square that has 16 units. So that's the area of the square, 16 units. In order to find just one length of the side of the squares, we would take the square root of 16. The square root of 16 is 4. So the length of one of these sides of the square will be equal to 4. Okay? Just another example. Let's say we have an area of a square that is 36 units. You want to find the length of the side of the square. You simply take the square root. Square root of 36 is 6. So the length of the sides of the square is equal to 6. Remember, guys, square root is just figuring out which two numbers are going to multiply to equal the number underneath the square root. Remember, they have to be the same two numbers. Okay, and also remember that squaring a number and square root are inverse operations of each other. They undo each other. All right, so we're going to do some exploring with the Pythagorean theorem. Okay, so each side of a triangle is going to form a square. Okay, so if we look here, it says so the square off of leg 1, we're going to call a squared, and the square off of leg 2 is going to be b squared, and the square off of the hypotenuse is going to be equal to c squared. So again, we need to memorize that the Pythagorean theorem is a squared plus b squared equals c squared. We also must remember that a and B are always the legs of the triangle. Those two letters, those two variables always have to represent the legs. A and B are always legs. C always represents the hypotenuse of the right triangle. No matter what, we cannot switch these around. A and B have to be legs. C has to be the hypotenuse. Okay, so what we're going to discover in a second is that the square off the legs of a right triangle add to equal the square off the hypotenuse. Okay, so I'm going to do some practice with this now. Okay, so let's look at some examples. So here we have a right triangle. It is the triangle that is shaded in gray. Now I kept saying in this previous slide that the square off of leg 1, the square off of leg 2. What that means is if you look at this leg right here that is equal to 3, here is the square that is made off of this leg. Here is the square that is off of this leg 4. And here is the square that is off of the hypotenuse, which is equal to 5. So If we look at the square right here, it says this square is off of a leg of a triangle. To get the area of the square, we simply multiply the side length, 3, by 3. Or you can do 3 squared because 3 times 3 is 9, and 3 squared is also equal to 9. Okay, so the area of this square here is 9. If we look at this square, the length of one side of the square is equal to 4. So this is a square off of the other leg of the triangle. And to get the area of the square, we simply would multiply 4 by 4 or do 4 squared. Okay? And again, here we have a square that is off of the hypotenuse. The hypotenuse is equal to 5. So this is a square off of the hypotenuse of the triangle. And to get the area of this square here, we would multiply 5 by 5 or do 5 squared. Okay, so over here, we're going to experiment with the Pythagorean theorem and prove that it works. So it says in the Pythagorean theorem, sides A and B are the legs of the right triangle, like I said before. So what we're going to do is we're going to substitute or plug in the length of the legs of the triangle into our Pythagorean theorem. Again, guys, we must remember that A and B are always the legs, C is the hypotenuse. Now, it doesn't matter which leg you plug in for A and which leg you plug in for B. All that matters is your legs are always A and B, and your C is your hypotenuse. So I'm just going to go with the 3 first. 3 is my first leg, so I'm going to plug that into this text box. My second leg is 4, so that's going to be plugged in here. And my hypotenuse, which is equal to C, or which is C, is equal to 5. Okay? Now remember what the Pythagorean theorem tells me, that the sum of the squares of the legs of the sum of the square of the legs of the triangle are going to be equal to the hypotenuse squared. So I'm going to square both of these legs first. So 3 squared is equal to 3 times 3, which is equal to 9. 4 squared is equal to 4 times 4, which is 16. And then I'm going to come to this side of the equal sign. 5 squared is equal to 5 times 5, which is equal to 25. So now if this is a right triangle and if this works out, this side of the equal sign should equal 25. Well, 9 plus 16 equals 25. Does 25 equal 25? Yes, it absolutely does. So our Pythagorean theorem, of course, worked here because we have a right triangle. All right, we'll do one more together. Again, here we have a right triangle that's shaded in gray. I gave you the lengths of both of the legs and the hypotenuse. Okay, we're just going to make sure that this works out. Does the left side of the Pythagorean theorem equal the right side? All right, so again, I drew the squares off of the legs and off of the hypotenuse of the triangle just to show you. Again, what it means is the squares of the legs of the triangle are going to add up to the square of the hypotenuse. So again, guys, A and B are your legs, C is your hypotenuse. So your first leg of your triangle, where I'm going to plug in 9. My second leg of the triangle is 12, and my hypotenuse is 15. Again, notice your hypotenuse is always the side opposite of the right angle, and it is always the longest side. 15 is the longest or the biggest number between 9, 12, and 15. Okay, so now we're going to square these two legs and then add them to see if the sum equals the square of the hypotenuse. So 9 squared is equal to 81, and 12 squared is equal to 144. 15 squared is equal to 225. So now we want to make sure that the sum of those squares equals the sum of, or equals the square of the hypotenuse. Okay, so 81 plus 144 equals 225. Oops. Is 225 equal 225? Yes, it absolutely does. Okay, in the next couple of lessons, guys, you will be solving for a missing leg or a missing hypotenuse, but today we're just going to overall talk about what the Pythagorean theorem is. Of course, remember that the Pythagorean theorem only works for right triangles. The 3 pieces of a right triangle that we need to remember are the 2 legs and the hypotenuse. You must remember that the hypotenuse is the longest side of the triangle, and it is the side that is opposite of the right angle. Okay, also you need to memorize the Pythagorean theorem, which is a squared plus b squared equals c squared. You also need to remember that A and B are your legs, and C always is your hypotenuse. Okay, you guys are going to now do 13 and 14 on your own. You're simply going to look at the diagram here and plug in your legs, plug in your hypotenuse, and then make sure that the sum of the squares of the legs is equal to the hypotenuse squared. Okay, as always, guys, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask.